They locked him out of his own land and kept the only key. The next morning he bought the entire property that controlled the gate. 3 weeks later in court, that padlock hung on the wall like a trophy of justice. You know what state you're watching from. Drop your state in the comments and hit subscribe to Law HOA Karen Stories 88, because every week we unlock another story where the law meets justice, and justice always wins. I'm about to tell you how a Texas rancher turned a HOA's power play into their worst nightmare using nothing but patience paperwork and the kind of legal chess move that would make corporate lawyers weep. This isn't just about a fence or a gate. This is about what happens when small-town bullies meet someone who knows that in America, your property rights don't end where someone else's clipboard begins. And trust me, by the end of this story, you'll understand why that rusty padlock became the most expensive piece of metal in county history. The sun was barely kissing the horizon when I stepped onto my porch that Tuesday morning in March, coffee mugs steaming in the crisp Abilene air. 46 years on this earth had taught me to appreciate these quiet moments before the world demanded its pound of flesh. My cattle ranch stretched out before me like a promise, kept 300 acres of Texas soil that I'd worked every day for the past 8 years since moving down from Amarillo. The morning ritual was sacred black coffee, no sugar, and a slow survey of the land that represented everything I'd built from nothing. But that morning something was different. Something that would change everything. A brand new fence ran across my property line like a scar, gleaming metal posts catching the early light. In the center stood a gate I'd never seen before, painted black as midnight and locked with a padlock the size of my fist. A pristine white sign hung from the chain-link property access managed by Lakeside Meadows HOA. I stood there, coffee growing cold in my hand, staring at what looked like someone else's idea of progress cutting right through my American dream. My cattle were already gathering near the fence instinctively, knowing that something had come between them and their morning water from the natural spring that had sustained this land for generations. 2 men in matching polo shirts were tightening the last bolts on the gate mechanism, their movements efficient and practiced. They worked with the confidence of people who believed they were on the right side of something bigger than themselves. As they packed their tools, a silver SUV pulled up its paint job so perfect it looked like it had been detailed that morning. Out stepped Marjorie Kane, the HOA president, her heels clicking against the gravel with the authority of someone who had never doubted her right to be wherever she chose to stand. Designer sunglasses, pressed blazer, and a clipboard that she carried like a scepter of suburban power. "Good morning, Mr. Ridley," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone that customer service representatives use when they're about to deliver bad news with a smile. "You've been notified multiple times about the non-compliance issues with your property fencing. Until you bring your structures up to community aesthetic standards, this gate will remain closed to preserve the visual integrity of our neighborhood." I looked past her to where my cattle stood, already showing signs of distress as the Texas heat began to build. "Ma'am, my livestock need access to that spring. This gate blocks the only practical route to their water source." She adjusted her sunglasses and consulted her clipboard with the solemnity of someone reading scripture. "Mr. Ridley, our satellite imagery shows alternative water sources on your property. We've done our research, and we're confident that this temporary measure won't cause any genuine hardship." The gate clicked shut, with a sound like a judge's gavel, final and unforgiving. The padlock slid home with a metallic whisper that seemed to echo across the prairie. As her SUV disappeared down the road, trailing dust and the smell of expensive perfume, I found myself standing alone with my cattle and a problem that was about to teach me more about American property law than any civics class ever could. That evening, my neighbor Glenn Porter knocked on my kitchen door, his weathered face creased with concern. At 65, Glenn had the kind of wisdom that comes from decades of watching small-town politics play out in real time. We sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by the mounting pile of HOA notices that had been accumulating like storm clouds, visual inconsistency violations, non-conforming structure citations, and now daily fines of $100. For each day my property remained out of compliance. Glenn poured himself coffee from the pot I kept going all day and shook his head slowly. "Anthony, I've lived in this county for 30 years, and I've seen Marjorie run roughshod over anyone who doesn't fit her vision of suburban paradise. She's got the HOA board wrapped around her finger, and they've got the county commissioners thinking they're the guardians of property values. If you want peace, you bow down and pay whatever it costs to make your fence look like everyone else's. If you want to keep your dignity, you'd better be prepared for a fight that's going to test everything you believe about justice in America." I stared out the window at my cattle, now clustered around the emergency water troughs I'd hastily set up, and felt something harden in my chest like cooling steel. The next week, I attended my first HOA board meeting held in the community center that smelled of old carpet and fresh coffee. The conference table was surrounded by people who looked like they'd stepped out of a homeowner's magazine, all pressed clothes and serious expressions. Marjorie presided over the meeting with the kind of authority that comes from never having been seriously challenged. When it came time for public comments, I stood up and faced the people who had decided my fate without consulting me. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger building in my chest, "my fence may not match your aesthetic standards, but it's been keeping my cattle safe and contained for 8 years. This is a working ranch, not a suburban subdivision." "Mr. Ridley," she replied, her voice carrying the patience of someone explaining simple concepts to a slow child, "we all have to make sacrifices for the greater good of the community. Your property affects everyone's property values, and we have a responsibility to maintain standards that benefit all residents." As I walked back to my truck that night, an elderly woman named Paula Green caught my arm in the parking lot. She looked around nervously before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. "Be careful, Anthony. Marjorie doesn't know how to lose, and she's got resources you haven't even imagined yet. She destroyed my neighbor last year over a tree removal dispute, and he ended up selling his house just to escape the legal fees. But it was what I discovered the next morning that changed everything." As I walked the fence line documenting the situation for my own records, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. 3 houses on the same road as mine had fencing that was just as non-uniform as mine, if not more so. Mixed materials, different heights, various states of repair, yet none of them had received violation notices. None of them had gates blocking their access. The selective enforcement was so obvious that it felt like a slap in the face, a reminder that justice in small-town America sometimes depends more on who you know than what you've done. That afternoon, while checking on my cattle and refilling their water troughs in the growing heat, I spotted something that would prove to be the first crack in what seemed like an impenetrable wall of bureaucratic power. A small rectangular sign had appeared at the edge of the disputed area: "For sale, half-acre lot owner financing available." The plot of land that contained the gate, the very ground where my access rights were being denied, was apparently not even owned by the HOA. It was a separate parcel, and someone was looking to sell it. I stood there in the Texas sun, feeling the first glimmer of hope I'd experienced since this nightmare began, and pulled out my phone to call the number on the sign. The real estate agent's voice was cheerful and professional when I called about the half-acre lot. "Yes, it's been on the market for 6 months, she explained. "The previous owner inherited it from family but lives in California now. It's a unique piece of property because it controls access to about 4 other parcels, which is why we thought it might appeal to local investors or developers." I hung up the phone with my mind racing, already formulating a plan that would require patience, precision, and a level of legal chess playing that would make corporate lawyers proud. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with, and that meant diving deep into property records, easement laws, and the kind of bureaucratic detective work that most people pay professionals to handle. My college roommate Brett Lawson had gone into property management after we graduated, building a small empire of rental properties and investment LLCs across 3 counties. When I called him that evening explaining my situation, his laugh was immediate and knowing. "Anthony, you magnificent bastard," he said, his voice carrying the excitement of someone who had just been handed the perfect puzzle to solve. "What you're describing is a classic case of HOA overreach, and if that gate property isn't actually owned by the association, they've just handed you the keys to their own kingdom. Let me set up an LLC through my management company, and we'll make this purchase so quietly that Marjorie won't know what hit her until the deed is already recorded." The beauty of the plan was its simplicity. Brett's company would purchase the property through a limited liability company with a name so generic that it would disappear into the mountain of daily real estate transactions that flow through county records. Prairie Ventures LLC, he suggested, managed by Lawson Property Solutions, with no direct connection to my name appearing anywhere in the initial documentation. The seller was motivated, the price was reasonable, and most importantly, a title search revealed that the property was clear of any restrictions, liens, or rights of first refusal that might give the HOA legal standing to block the sale. While Brett handled the legal mechanics of the purchase, I found myself diving into local property law with the intensity of someone preparing for a bar exam. Texas easement law, I discovered, is built on the principle that access rights are fundamental to property ownership, dating back to the days when ranch land was measured in sections, and disputes were settled by men who understood that cattle don't recognize suburban aesthetic standards. The more I read, the more I realized that Marjorie and her HOA board had made a critical mistake in their assumption that they could simply lock a gate and force compliance through bureaucratic intimidation. The research also revealed something else interesting. The Lakeside Meadows HOA had been incorporated only 5 years earlier, long after the original subdivision was developed and sold. Many of the property easements and access rights predated the HOA's existence, which meant that their authority was far more limited than their confident enforcement actions suggested. I spent evenings at the county courthouse copying old survey maps and deed records, building a paper trail that told the real story of who owned what and who had the right to control access to essential resources like water. 3 weeks after that first phone call, I found myself sitting in a title company office, watching Brett sign documents that would transfer ownership of the gate property to Prairie Ventures LLC. The closing was routine, professional, and utterly unremarkable to everyone except me. When the title agent handed over the keys to the padlock, the metal felt warm in my palm, like holding a small piece of justice that had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt the quiet satisfaction that comes from turning someone else's power play into your own strategic advantage. That afternoon, I walked to the gate alone, my heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and nervous energy. The padlock that had represented everything wrong with unchecked authority now yielded to my key like it had been waiting for this moment all along. The gate swung open with a smooth mechanical whisper, and my cattle, sensing their opportunity, began moving toward the spring that had sustained this land long before any HOA existed. The sound of running water over stones seemed louder than usual, like nature itself was celebrating the restoration of an ancient rite. I was still standing by the open gate watching my cattle drink from the spring when Marjorie's silver SUV appeared on the horizon, trailing dust and authority. She wasn't alone this time. 2 board members flanked her as she approached, and Deputy Sheriff Morales followed in his patrol car, clearly called to deal with what someone had reported as a property dispute in progress. The deputy was a reasonable man in his 50s, someone who had seen enough small-town drama to recognize the difference between actual crime and bureaucratic theater. When Marjorie demanded that I be arrested for criminal trespass, Deputy Morales asked to see documentation of ownership and access rights. I handed him the deed, the title insurance policy, and the survey that clearly showed the gate property as a separate parcel now owned by Prairie Ventures LLC. He studied the documents, carefully compared them to the property description in his dispatch notes, and shook his head with the weary expression of someone who has been called to referee a chess match between children. "Ma'am, this is a civil property dispute, not a criminal matter. Mr. Ridley has documentation showing ownership of the parcel containing the gate, and without a court order to the contrary, he has the right to control access to his own property." The drive back to town was interesting. As we wound through the same streets where this conflict had begun, I couldn't help but think about the broader implications of what was happening. In a time when Americans are dealing with rising property taxes, increasing insurance costs, and the constant pressure of inflation eating away at retirement savings, the idea that a small group of neighbors could arbitrarily restrict access to essential resources felt like a violation of something fundamental. The stories on the radio that morning had been full of international conflicts and political divisions, but here in small-town Texas, the real battle was being fought over the most basic American principle, the right to use your own property as you see fit. That evening, Glenn stopped by with a 6-pack of beer, and the kind of grin that suggested he'd been waiting for this moment for months. "You magnificent son of a gun," he said, raising his bottle in a toast. "You just turned their own game against them, and they don't even know it yet. But don't think this is over. Marjorie's pride is wounded now, and a wounded HOA president is like a wounded animal, dangerous and unpredictable. She's going to come back with lawyers and county commissioners and every bureaucratic weapon she can find." He was right, of course. That weekend, I received a registered letter from the law firm representing the Lakeside Meadows HOA demanding that I cease all access to the disputed property and threatening legal action if I continued to interfere with their management of community resources. The letter was thick with legal terminology and implied threats, but it had one critical flaw. It still assumed that they had some kind of legal authority over property they didn't own. I filed the letter with the growing collection of HOA documents that was becoming my evening reading and began preparing for the next phase of what was clearly going to be a longer war than any of us had anticipated. The real test came 3 days later when I arrived at the gate to find a new chain wrapped around it with a different lock that my key wouldn't open. A fresh sign had been posted, "Access restricted by court order." But when I called Deputy Morales to report the vandalism, he informed me that no such court order existed in the county records. Someone was playing a very dangerous game of legal chicken, and it was about to backfire in spectacular fashion. The annual community barbecue had always been a peaceful affair, but this year it felt more like a campaign rally split down the middle. Families who had been neighbors for decades found themselves choosing sides over potato salad and sweet tea, while children played obliviously in the background, unaware that their parents were fighting over principles that would shape their community for years to come. Glenn had prepared small buttons reading "Property Rights Matter," which he distributed quietly to anyone who would take one, while Marjorie held court near the dessert table explaining to anyone who would listen how my actions were, threatening the very fabric of civilized society. I wasn't expecting Jake Morrison to approach me that afternoon. At 19, Jake was home from college for spring break, working part-time as a freelance video editor and drone pilot to pay for his computer science degree. He had grown up in the neighborhood watching the slow transformation from rural farmland to suburban development, and his perspective on the conflict was refreshingly uncomplicated. "Mr. Ridley," he said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had grown up with technology as a native language, "what they did to your gate isn't just wrong, it's probably illegal, and I think I can prove it. Jake's drone footage from the previous Sunday revealed something that none of us had anticipated. The HOA maintenance crew had been working on the property during non-business hours, installing additional fencing and gate hardware without any visible permits or authorization. The video showed Marjorie herself directing the operation, checking her watch repeatedly as if she knew she was operating outside normal procedures. More importantly, the footage captured the moment when they discovered the new padlock I had installed and their decision to simply cut it off and replace it with their own. In Texas, that's called criminal mischief, regardless of any claimed authority to manage community property. The video went viral in local social media groups within hours of Jake posting it. Comments poured in from residents who had been dealing with similar issues across different HOA-managed communities throughout the county. Stories of arbitrary fines, selective enforcement, and administrative overreach that painted a picture of systemic abuse that went far beyond my individual situation. One comment particularly stood out from Paula Green, the elderly woman who had warned me after that first board meeting. They forced my neighbor to remove a 100-year-old oak tree because it didn't match their approved landscaping plan. The tree had been there since before any of us were born. But the real game changer came when my attorney Tom Baird filed a Freedom of Information Act request for all HOA correspondence with county officials over the past 5 years. What we discovered in those emails was a pattern of coordination between Marjorie and certain county commissioners that raised serious questions about whether public officials were using their authority to support private interests. References to campaign contributions, zoning variance approvals, and what appeared to be quid pro quo arrangements that would make any reasonable person question whether the law was being applied equally to all citizens. The most damaging revelation came buried in an email chain from 3 years earlier. The HOA's right of first refusal on any property sales within their jurisdiction had expired, and Marjorie herself had recommended against renewing it to save on legal fees. The irony was devastating. The very woman who was claiming authority to control access to my property had voluntarily surrendered the legal mechanism that might have given her that authority. Tom filed the document with the court as evidence that the HOA's current actions exceeded their legal standing under both their own bylaws and state property law. Meanwhile, the broader political climate was making our local dispute resonate with frustrations that extended far beyond cattle ranches and suburban fences. Americans were dealing with supply chain disruptions that made basic goods more expensive, immigration policies that seemed to change with every news cycle, and international conflicts that made everyone feel less secure about the future. In that context, a story about neighbors using bureaucratic power to restrict access to basic resources like water struck a nerve that surprised everyone involved. Local radio stations began covering the story as an example of how ordinary Americans could fight back against administrative overreach regardless of the political party in power. The HOA board meeting that month was standing room only, with residents who had never participated in community governance suddenly showing up to voice opinions that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. When Marjorie called for public comments, the line of speakers included people I had never met but who clearly saw my situation as representative of something larger and more troubling. An elderly veteran named Robert Chen spoke about fighting for freedom overseas only to find it under attack in his own neighborhood. A young mother named Lisa Rodriguez talked about the stress of constantly worrying whether her children's playground equipment met HOA standards while her property taxes continued to rise. The most powerful moment came when Dr. Patricia Williams, the county veterinarian, submitted a formal letter stating that restricting livestock access to natural water sources during drought conditions constituted animal welfare endangerment under state law. Her professional opinion carried the weight of legal authority, and she made it clear that any continued interference with cattle access to the spring could result in criminal charges against the individuals responsible. The letter was read into the meeting minutes, creating an official record that would be difficult for anyone to ignore. Deputy Morales attended that meeting in an unofficial capacity, but his presence sent a clear message about how law enforcement viewed the escalating situation. During the break, he approached me privately to discuss the criminal mischief charges that could potentially be filed based on Jake's drone footage. The destruction of my padlock and the installation of unauthorized barriers on property I owned were clear violations of state law, regardless of any claimed administrative authority. The question was whether I wanted to pursue criminal charges or focus on the civil litigation that was already moving through the courts. The answer came when someone leaked internal HOA financial records showing that over $40,000 in community fees had been spent on legal consultants and administrative actions related to my property dispute. The same neighbors who were struggling with rising utility costs and property tax increases discovered that their HOA dues were being used to fund what appeared to be a personal vendetta against someone who had simply refused to replace a fence that had been adequate for 8 years. The revelation split the community in ways that would take years to heal, with many residents demanding a complete audit of HOA spending and decision-making processes. But the most significant development was yet to come. Jake's continued drone surveillance revealed that the disputed gate property was being used for purposes that had never been disclosed to the community. The natural spring that I claimed was essential for my cattle was actually part of a larger watershed that supplied water to several downstream properties. By controlling access to that water source, the HOA was essentially controlling a public resource that had been accessible to multiple property owners for generations. The environmental implications alone were enough to bring state agencies into the dispute, adding another layer of complexity that none of us had anticipated. As October arrived with its promise of cooler weather and harvest season, I found myself in the strange position of being both a local celebrity and a pariah depending on which part of town you visited. The coffee shop where I had eaten breakfast for 8 years was split between customers who nodded approvingly when I walked in and others who pointedly looked away. But the growing support from unexpected quarters, including other ranchers, small business owners, and even some urban professionals who commuted to jobs in larger cities, suggested that this dispute had tapped into something deeper than property line disagreements. The real test was coming, though. Marjorie had filed for a temporary restraining order to prevent any further access to the gate property, while the underlying ownership dispute was resolved in court. If granted, it would effectively restore her control over the situation while legal proceedings dragged on for months or potentially years. The hearing was scheduled for the following week, and Tom warned me that we needed to be prepared for anything, including the possibility that a judge might decide to maintain the status quo until all parties could present their cases in a full trial. The stakes had never been higher, and the outcome would determine not just my access to water for my cattle, but the precedent for how property rights and community authority would be balanced in our corner of Texas for years to come. The courthouse steps were crowded with more people than I had expected when we arrived for the restraining order hearing. News of the dispute had spread beyond our immediate community, attracting supporters, critics, and the simply curious who saw in our small-town drama a reflection of larger national tensions about individual rights versus collective authority. Jake was there with his camera documenting everything for what had become an ongoing video series about the case. Glenn wore his best suit and carried a folder thick with signatures from neighbors who supported keeping the gate open. Even Paula Green had shown up despite her obvious nervousness about taking sides in such a public way. Tom Baird had prepared our case with the thoroughness of someone who understood that this hearing would likely determine the outcome of the entire dispute. His briefcase contained not just the property deeds and survey maps, but photographs documenting the condition of my cattle before and after access to the spring was restricted, veterinary records showing the stress impact of limited water access during the hottest part of the year, and financial documentation proving that the alternative water sources suggested by the HOA would cost thousands of dollars to develop and maintain. Most importantly, he had obtained expert testimony from a hydrologist confirming that the spring was indeed the primary sustainable water source for livestock on my property. Marjorie's legal team arrived in a black sedan that looked like it cost more than most people's annual salary. The lead attorney, Marcus Pemberton, was known throughout the county as someone who specialized in municipal law and had a reputation for aggressive tactics in defense of institutional authority. His assistant carried boxes of documents that suggested they had prepared for a much longer and more complex hearing than the simple restraining order request that was officially on the calendar. The message was clear: they intended to overwhelm the opposition with paperwork precedent and procedural arguments that would make the judge sympathetic to their request for maintaining order while the dispute was resolved. When Judge Sarah Martinez called the case, the courtroom was nearly full, with several people standing along the walls because there weren't enough seats for everyone who wanted to witness the proceedings. Judge Martinez was known as a fair but no-nonsense jurist who had little patience for theatrics or legal maneuvering that didn't serve the interests of justice. She had grown up in rural Texas herself, and her reputation suggested that she understood the practical realities of ranch life in ways that purely academic legal arguments might not address effectively. Pemberton's opening argument was polished and persuasive, focusing on the importance of community standards, property value protection, and the need for orderly dispute resolution through proper channels. He argued that my purchase of the gate property was essentially an end run around legitimate community governance, and that allowing individual property owners to circumvent HOA authority would set a dangerous precedent that could undermine the entire concept of managed communities. His presentation included charts showing property values in similar communities with and without strong HOA enforcement, and testimony from Marjorie about the careful planning and community input that had gone into establishing the disputed restrictions. But when Tom stood to present our case, the tone in the courtroom shifted noticeably. Instead of legal abstractions about community governance, he focused on the immediate practical reality of what the gate closure meant for livestock that had depended on spring water for generations before any HOA existed. He presented photographs of my cattle, clustering around inadequate emergency water sources, and played audio recordings of Dr. Williams explaining the veterinary consequences of restricted water access during drought conditions. Most powerfully, he read from historical property records showing that water access easements had been written into the original land grants that predated any modern development by more than a century. The turning point came when Judge Martinez asked Pemberton directly whether the HOA had legal standing to restrict access to water sources on property they didn't own, particularly when that access was protected by historical easements that predated their organization's existence. His answer was technically correct, but practically devastating. The HOA claimed general authority to manage community resources, but when pressed for specific legal citations supporting that authority in this particular situation, he was forced to admit that their position relied primarily on administrative precedent, rather than clear statutory authority. In rural Texas, where water rights are considered almost sacred, that admission carried weight that extended far beyond the immediate legal question. Judge Martinez's ruling was swift and unambiguous. She denied the restraining order request, finding that the HOA had failed to demonstrate clear legal authority to restrict access to historically protected water sources on property they didn't own. More significantly, she granted our motion for a preliminary injunction, preventing any further interference with access to the gate property, while the underlying ownership and easement questions were resolved through proper legal channels. The gavel came down with a sound that seemed to echo through the courthouse corridors, and I felt a sense of relief that I hadn't experienced since this entire ordeal began. But the real victory came in what happened next. As we filed out of the courtroom, several people approached me to share their own stories of HOA overreach, zoning disputes, and bureaucratic harassment that had made their lives miserable for months or years. A young veteran named David Santos told me about fighting the county for 2 years to get approval for a wheelchair ramp at his home, only to be told that it didn't meet aesthetic guidelines for his neighborhood. An elderly couple, Frank and Marie Kowalski, described losing their life savings in legal fees fighting an HOA that demanded they remove solar panels that were reducing their electricity costs in retirement. These conversations continued in the coffee shop, across from the courthouse, where an impromptu gathering developed into something approaching a community organizing meeting. Jake documented it all, capturing the moment when individual frustrations began crystallizing into collective action. Someone suggested forming a county-wide organization to monitor HOA practices and provide legal resources for residents facing similar disputes. Another person proposed pushing for county commissioners to require greater transparency and accountability in HOA financial management. What had started as my personal dispute over cattle access was becoming a broader movement for property rights and community governance reform. The media attention was unexpected but welcome. Local television stations began covering the story as an example of successful resistance to bureaucratic overreach, while regional newspapers picked up the narrative as a symbol of individual determination prevailing over institutional arrogance. The coverage was generally sympathetic, focusing on the David and Goliath aspects of the story while avoiding the political polarization that seemed to infect most news coverage these days. In a time when Americans felt increasingly powerless against large institutions, both public and private, my small victory resonated with people who had their own stories of fighting against seemingly impossible odds. The hate mail was also unexpected but perhaps inevitable. Letters arrived accusing me of being everything from a selfish individualist who didn't care about community standards to a dangerous radical who was undermining the foundations of civilized society. Phone calls came at all hours, some supportive and others threatening legal action, economic boycotts, or worse. The stress was beginning to take its toll not just on me, but on neighbors who had supported my position and now found themselves targets of similar harassment from the more militant supporters of HOA authority. But the support outweighed the criticism by a significant margin. Donations arrived to help with legal fees, along with offers of expert testimony, research assistance, and moral support from people as far away as California and Florida who had followed the story online. A retired federal judge sent a letter explaining how my case illustrated important constitutional principles about property rights and due process that extended far beyond local zoning disputes. A group of law students from the University of Texas offered to research similar cases and develop legal strategies that could be useful in appeals or related litigation. Most importantly, the preliminary injunction meant that my cattle had reliable access to water again, and the daily stress of emergency measures and constant monitoring was finally beginning to ease. As autumn progressed and the Texas heat started to moderate, I found myself able to focus on normal ranch operations for the first time in months. But I also knew that this was just the beginning of a longer legal process that would ultimately determine not just my property rights, but the precedent for how similar disputes would be resolved throughout Texas and potentially beyond. The final hearing arrived on a crisp November morning, that felt like nature itself was holding its breath. The courthouse was even more crowded than before, with local news crews setting up equipment on the front steps and people driving in from neighboring counties to witness what had become known throughout East Texas as the Gate case. I wore my best suit and carried a folder containing every document that had become important over the past 8 months. Property deeds, historical easement records, veterinary reports, and photographs, documenting everything from my breeders' cattle's health to the condition of the natural spring that had started this entire controversy. Judge Martinez called the court to order with an efficiency that suggested she understood the broader implications of her decision. This wasn't just about one rancher's access to water or one HOA's interpretation of community standards. The case had become a test of fundamental principles about property rights, community governance, and the balance between individual liberty and collective authority that defines much of American civil life. Legal observers from the State Bar Association were present, along with representatives from property rights organizations and municipal government associations who would use this decision as precedent in future disputes. Tom's presentation was masterful in its simplicity. Instead of getting lost in complex legal arguments, he focused on the basic timeline of events and the fundamental question of legal authority. He established that the spring had provided water to livestock on this property for over a century, that historical easements specifically protected agricultural access, and that the HOA's authority to restrict that access was based on administrative assumptions rather than clear legal standing. Most importantly, he presented evidence that the HOA's own bylaws had never been properly amended to include the authority they were claiming, making their actions a clear case of institutional overreach. The HOA's attorney fought back with everything he had, but his arguments increasingly sounded like legal technicalities designed to obscure rather than clarify the central issues. When Judge Martinez asked him to cite specific statutory authority for restricting access to historically protected water sources, his response was a 15-minute discourse on community planning principles that never actually answered the question. His presentation included character witnesses testifying to Marjorie's dedication to community improvement, but none of them could explain why cattle access to spring water threatened neighborhood property values or community safety. The breakthrough moment came when Tom presented newly discovered evidence that changed the entire legal landscape. Research conducted by the law students from UT had uncovered the original 1978 survey map that clearly designated the disputed area as an agricultural ingress easement, specifically intended to protect livestock access to natural water sources. The easement had been written into the original property grants and had never been legally terminated or modified despite decades of subsequent development and changing ownership. Under Texas property law, such historical easements take precedence over later administrative restrictions, regardless of the authority claimed by HOAs or other governing bodies. But the most dramatic revelation was yet to come. Financial records subpoenaed from the HOA revealed that over $60,000 in community dues had been spent on legal fees, consulting costs, and administrative actions related to my property dispute. More damaging, those records showed that several of the consulting contracts had been awarded to companies owned by Marjorie's relatives, suggesting a level of self-dealing that violated both the HOA's fiduciary responsibilities and potentially state laws governing nonprofit organizations. The financial mismanagement was so egregious that Judge Martinez ordered an immediate audit of all HOA finances pending further investigation. When the judge delivered her ruling, her words carried the weight of legal precedent that would influence property rights disputes throughout Texas for years to come. She ruled that the agricultural easement was valid and enforceable, that the HOA had exceeded its legal authority in restricting access to historically protected water sources, and that my purchase of the Gate property was legitimate, would be upheld. More significantly, she ordered the HOA to pay all court costs and legal fees, and mandated the establishment of a community oversight board to ensure that future disputes would be handled through transparent processes rather than administrative intimidation. The gavel came down with a finality that seemed to reverberate through the courthouse and beyond. But the real celebration began when we walked outside to find dozens of neighbors, supporters, and even some former critics waiting to congratulate me on what they recognized as a victory for property rights and community accountability. Glenn was there with his characteristic grin and a cooler full of beer. Jake was documenting everything for what had become a widely followed video series about the case. Even Paula Green was there, no longer nervous about taking sides, but proudly wearing one of the Property Rights Matter buttons that had become symbols of the broader movement. That evening, I took the original padlock that had started this entire controversy and hung it on the wall of my equipment shed, not as a trophy of personal victory, but as a reminder of what happens when ordinary citizens refuse to accept that bureaucratic authority automatically trumps individual rights. The key to that lock now hangs beside it, a small piece of metal that represents something much larger about American values and the importance of standing up for principles even when the odds seem overwhelming. The community healing began almost immediately. A special HOA election removed Marjorie and most of the board members who had supported the aggressive enforcement policies, replacing them with neighbors who understood that community governance should serve residents rather than control them. New bylaws were established requiring transparency in all financial decisions, community input on major policy changes, and respect for existing property rights and historical easements. The annual community barbecue that fall was genuinely celebratory for the first time in years, with families who had been divided by the controversy coming together around shared values of fairness and mutual respect. The broader impact of the case continues to unfold. Similar property rights disputes in counties across Texas now cite our case as precedent for challenging HOA overreach and protecting historical easements. The financial audit revealed enough irregularities to trigger a state investigation into HOA governance practices, leading to legislative proposals for greater oversight and accountability. Most importantly, the case demonstrated that ordinary Americans still have the tools to fight back against institutional abuse when they're willing to invest the time, energy, and resources necessary to pursue justice through proper legal channels. The real lesson here isn't about fences or gates or even cattle ranches. It's about the fundamental American principle that your property rights don't end where someone else's clipboard begins. In a time when everything seems to be controlled by faceless bureaucrats and corporate interests, this story proves that individual citizens can still make a difference when they refuse to accept that might makes right. That's what HOA Karen Stories 88 is all about. Real people facing real problems and finding real solutions through determination, creativity, and an unwavering commitment to justice. If this story resonated with you, there are dozens more in our archive showing how ordinary Americans fight back against everything from corporate bullies to government overreach to neighborhood tyrants who think a clipboard gives them the right to control other people's lives. Hit that subscribe button and join a community of people who believe that justice isn't just something that happens to other people. It's something we create every day by refusing to let bullies win, whether they're wearing corporate suits or HOA badges. Drop a comment about your own experiences with property disputes, bureaucratic harassment, or neighborhood conflicts. Your story might be the next one we tell, and your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find the courage to fight back. Because at the end of the day, the only thing standing between freedom and tyranny is people like you who are willing to stand up and say enough is enough. Welcome to HOA Karen Stories 88, where justice isn't just a concept, it's a way of life.